implementation of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and will provide examples of near-term restoration projects as well. DWR scientists will present information that describes salmon biology and the Delta ecosystem with respect to both the SWP and the CVP, the life history diversity of those species, rearing and migration, hatchery production, and the San Francisco Bay and marine portions of the salmonid life cycle. Additionally, we will discuss how the draft BDCP would create substantial restoration opportunities for pelagic and salmonid fishes, as well as a credible adaptive management plan for the restoration of the estuary. DWR suggests the board take advantage of the consensus approach being developed in the BDCP process and incorporate this information into the Water Quality Control Plan update. The BDCP is a collaborative effort involving multiple state and federal agencies and stakeholder organizations, and is consistent with the co-equal goals of providing more reliable water supply for California and protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem. The science presented in the BDCP addresses the ecological changes in the food web, invasive species, as well as water quality. Some of the proposed large-scale conservation measures would result in adaptations to flow and timing, but are designed with fisheries agencies' input to help recover listed species. These conservation measures are solutions proposed in the draft BDCP. They are extensive and encompass the ecosystem as a whole, which is a departure from historical and more recent practices of addressing species decline in the Delta. This broader approach provides a balanced forum to address public interests. A large-scale program related to the BDCP is the Fish Restoration Program Agreement. The primary objective of the FRPA, or FRPA as we call it, an agreement between the Department of Water Resources and the Department of Fish and Game, is to implement the fish habitat restoration requirements of the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS biological opinions for SWP and CVP operations, as well as the longfin smelt take permit for the State Water Project. In March 2012, the program released an implementation strategy for habitat restoration, including restoration targets and a 10-year timeline for acreage targets for meeting restoration requirements. DWR respectfully requests that any potential changes to flows in the Delta be considered in a broader context within an adaptive, flexible, and collaborative framework, such as the BDCP. The BDCP is a plan that demonstrates a commitment to sound science and Delta ecosystem restoration, along with water supply reliability. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for today. On my right is Dr. Brett Harvey, an environmental scientist at DWR. He will be speaking to his presentation, pardon me, will cover new information showing there is an overemphasis on export operations and an underemphasis on life history diversity, juvenile rearing habitat, and the marine portion of the salmonid cycle. To his right is Gardner Jones, a staff environmental scientist at DWR. His presentation today will highlight the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, focusing on the suite of conservation measures. He will also present information regarding the DWR, or the BDCP decision tree. And lastly, to Gardner's right is Dennis McEwen, who is an environmental program manager at DWR. His presentation today will highlight examples of near-term actions as well as other efforts which are intended to provide near-term benefits. Brett?
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? I'm a little vocally challenged today, so hopefully I'll get through this thing. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the many people at DWR's Division of Environmental Services that helped prepare our workshop submittal and this presentation. I was just one of the lucky guys that was picked to give the presentation. I also thank the board for this opportunity to present compelling new information that we hope will provide a frame of reference for your future deliberations. As Dr. Messer explained, Mr. Jones and Mr. McEwen are going to lay out DWR's management vision that is grounded in our current understanding of the ecology of Central Valley waterways. My role as the lead-off for our presentation is to describe that current ecological understanding, specifically as it relates to Central Valley salmon. The traditional conceptual model of salmon management in Central Valley views the Sacramento River like a leaky pipe. Juvenile salmon are produced at the top of the pipe, then must make their way along the pipe to the ocean. Sources of mortality along the way, like stranding on floodplains, entrainment by water diversions and predation, are essentially viewed as leaks that reduce juvenile production at the end of the pipe. Okay. I said the leaky pipe model is the traditional model because it's been the long-standing model that's guided salmon management for decades. But it's important to understand that in many respects, this is still the current conceptual model underlying many salmon management actions in the Central Valley. These actions include fixing the biggest perceived leaks, like closing the cross-channel gates to keep fish from wandering into the Central Delta, and restricting exports to minimize diversion losses. These actions also include producing more juveniles and hatcheries at the top of the pipe to make up for the leaks, often chucking them nearer to the ocean before release to bypass the leaky sections of the pipe, and to get them to the ocean as quickly as possible. As we know, salmon have not thrived under this management model, with most populations continuing to decline. In the report we submitted to the board and in this presentation, we focus on an alternative conceptual model for guiding fisheries management in the Central Valley, what we call the bet hedging model. The bet hedging model is based on emerging research from university and agency scientists. Instead of a leaky pipe, this model views salmon populations in a broader perspective. Central to this model is a recognition of the importance of a suite of habitat types which create multiple opportunities for rearing and growth along the juvenile migration corridor. I specifically mention growth because juvenile fork length is one of the key predictors of a juvenile's survival in the ocean. Examples of these important habitats are tributary streams, connected riparian corridors, seasonal floodplains, freshwater tidal wetlands, and brackish marsh. From a management perspective, we call it the bet hedging model because we can't be sure which element of the model will be most effective at increasing juvenile survival. Most likely it will be a combination of interacting factors, with the most important element varying from year to year with environmental conditions. In the same way, we also call it the bet hedging model from the perspective of juvenile salmon because the management plan we are advocating will promote a variety of life history trajectories within salmon populations that are geared toward different environmental conditions. When I say life history trajectory, I refer to the timing of major life events, the age of a juvenile when it migrates from its natal stream, how quickly it migrates, where it resides along the way and for how long, the amount of time it spends in the estuary and the ocean, and eventually the season when it migrates back to fresh water as an adult and spawns. Life history trajectories are known to vary not only between the named runs like fall, winter, and spring, but also within each of these runs. Adopting management practices that promote life history diversity in Central Valley salmon will provide resilience for these populations in our highly variable and rapidly changing climate. You'll notice that this model also includes improved hatchery management to facilitate life history diversity in salmon populations, and I'll talk briefly about this later. Also notice that the bet hedging model includes plugging some of the same leaks that are in the leaky pipe model, particularly to protect listed fishes, because there's still a valid argument that this may reduce juvenile losses. The difference is that in the bet hedging model, plugging these leaks is no longer considered a primary tool for recovering salmon populations. Since this is perhaps one of the biggest contrasts between the leaky pipe model and the bet hedging model, I'm going to spend some time reviewing past studies and recent data that supports a reduced emphasis on exports and an elevated role for habitat and life history diversity as tools for restoring salmon. Remember that one of the major actions based on the leaky pipe model is to plug the leaks when juvenile salmon are migrating by them and to push juveniles along the pipe as quickly as possible. Since the export facilities are considered the biggest leak in the system, restricting exports has been a primary tool and central focus of regulation. So why do we downplay the importance of exports in the bet hedging model? Well, over the years, a number of studies have used a variety of statistical techniques to examine the role of inflow and exports on the survival of juveniles in the Delta. For the most part, these studies found that inflow has a significant positive effect on juvenile survival in both the San Joaquin and the Sacramento River sides of the Delta. But results for an export effect have been mixed. We tried to make sense of these results. We approached this question from a different angle and found evidence which may partly explain the lack of consistent export effects in these survival studies. We looked at salvage rates of untagged Chinook salmon in relation to an indicator of juvenile production. The idea was to look at the proportion of Central Valley juveniles that were salvaged each year, both before and after export restrictions were implemented as part of the Bay Delta Accord. Since the exact number of juveniles in the Central Valley in any given year is unknown, we used the number of returning adults from the preceding year, known as escapement, as the best available long-term barometer of juvenile production. We found at the State Water Project facility there was a significant drop in the rate of salvage relative to escapement after 1995 when the Bay Delta Accord was implemented. For reasons we don't fully understand, a similar drop did not occur at the federal facility. To better understand the drop in salvage rate, we also looked at inflow and export volume during the months when juvenile salmon migrate through the delta. Here you can see that there was a small but insignificant increase in average inflow after implementation of the Bay Delta Accord. There was also a more noticeable but still not significant drop in average export following the Bay Delta Accord. Only when export is considered relative to inflow was a significant change found, with a 43% drop in the average export to inflow ratio occurring following the Bay Delta Accord. This suggests that a reduction in exports relative to inflow was the major operational change since the Bay Delta Accord that led to a drop in juvenile salvage rate, and presumably also juvenile salmon losses, since those two figures are highly correlated. Reduced salvage rates may in turn help explain why many of the coated wire tag studies mentioned earlier found mixed or no export effect on juvenile survival. We suggest that export restrictions during these months may have dampened juvenile losses below a threshold, such that changes in exports within restricted levels does not produce a measurable effect. Another possible reason why survival studies don't find a consistent export effect is that exports do not have as big an influence over migration into the central delta as previously thought. Juvenile salmon that migrate into the central delta are known to have considerably higher mortality rates relative to juveniles that stay in the Sacramento River. The primary entry point for Sacramento River juveniles into the central delta is at the junction with Georgian Slough, shown here in the illustration and also in the aerial picture at the bottom right. According to the leaky pipe model, exports attract juveniles into the central delta at this junction by increasing Sacramento River flow into Georgian Slough. Recent telemetry studies at this junction confirm that migrating juveniles essentially go with the flow. In other words, the probability of a juvenile migrating into the central delta at this junction roughly equates to the fraction of flow leaving the junction down Georgian Slough. By flow, I mean tidal flow at the moment a juvenile encounters the junction, not flow averaged over days or weeks, because from a fish's perspective, instantaneous tidal flow is what matters. Recent evaluations of tidal flows at this junction show that higher inflow reduces the fraction of flow into Georgian Slough, but that exports have virtually no effect. This series of graphs depicts tidal flows produced by DSM-2 hydro. They show the flow fraction leaving the junction into Georgian Slough at 3 different levels of inflow, while keeping export constant. In each graph, the fraction of flow into Georgian Slough is depicted over a 24-hour period. In the graph on the left, at low inflows, the effect of tides on flow is strong, with incoming tides causing a significant increase in the fraction of flow entering Georgian Slough. At higher levels of inflow, the influence of the tidal cycle was dampened, and the fraction of flow entering Georgian Slough during the high tides was greatly reduced. Now we're looking at flow fraction into Georgian Slough at different levels of export. For this series of graphs, inflow was constant and relatively low, a situation in which exports would be expected to have the most pronounced effect. But as you can see, exports had virtually no effect on the fraction of flow leaving the junction into Georgian Slough, even though exports at 10,000 CFS were nearly equal to inflow. The same lack of export effect was observed at medium inflow and also at high inflow. So in addition to the reduced salvage rate after 1995, the lack of export effect on Sacramento River flow into the interior delta may go a long way to explaining the inability of survival studies to find a consistent export effect on juvenile survival. Now I want to be clear. We're not saying that exports have no effect on salmon populations or that export restrictions have had no benefit, because the evidence we presented on lower salvage rates clearly demonstrates lower salvage at the state facility, and for salmon, entrainment loss and salvage are highly correlated, like I said before. What we are saying is that the impact of exports under current management conditions is likely considerably smaller than previously thought. And if regulations and management continue to focus on export restrictions as the primary tool for restoring salmon populations, chances are it ain't going to happen. So, if rushing juveniles to the ocean and restricting exports hasn't worked, as they clearly haven't. A new approach is in order, and this approach should be based on a better understanding of salmon ecology in the Central Valley. We particularly want to emphasize the importance of fostering life history diversity by providing a broad variety and an abundance of alternative rearing habitats. The importance of life history diversity to the resilience of salmon populations is one of the key points we want to emphasize today. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, life history diversity means that individuals within the population vary in the timing of their major life events, such as migrations and spawning. It is fairly common knowledge that there are 4 distinct runs of Central Valley Chinook, named for the seasons when they return to spawn. But even within each of these major runs, there has historically been variation in life history. The importance of this intra-run variation to the resilience of Chinook salmon populations is a lot like the economic strategy of diversifying your asset portfolio, which can be paraphrased: don't invest all your money in a single type of asset, or you may lose your shirt when the market shifts or fails. For salmon, life history diversity is a bet hedging strategy to buffer against a variable environment. For example, here are some hypothetical life history distributions for the time of year when a juvenile enters the ocean. The first few months are the most critical time of a salmon's ocean residence. Salmon must feed and grow quickly to avoid predation. If seasonal upwelling is early, fueling abundant food production in the ocean, early migrants gain an advantage over juveniles that have stayed in the relatively less productive freshwater environment. However, if ocean upwelling is delayed, early migrants will find little food for growth, leaving them highly vulnerable to predation. In this case, individuals following a life history with delayed ocean migration will have a better chance of survival to adulthood. Historically, the distribution for timing of ocean entry might have resembled the broad distribution on the left. A second scenario, one that is more typical of today's salmon population, has a very narrow range for the time of ocean entry. The problem with the narrow distribution is that if it coincides with a period of low ocean productivity, the entire population is vulnerable. With the broad distribution, a much smaller proportion of the population will be affected, and the rest of the population, following different life history trajectories, will buffer the loss. The same concept applies to other life history events. It is always better if the timing of migrations and spawning are spread out, rather than concentrated within a narrow range. Unfortunately, recent evidence suggests that the situation for Central Valley salmon is most like the narrow life history distribution. In the face of climate change, with environmental conditions becoming more variable, it is imperative to restore these natural buffering mechanisms to the population. I want to point out that this isn't just a hypothetical concept. According to analysis by the National Marine Fisheries Service, the consequences of a narrow range of ocean entry times are thought to be a major factor in the 2008-2009 collapse of fall run Chinook salmon. To better quantify the loss of life history diversity for Central Valley salmon, researchers from the University of California looked at historical escapement data from Central Valley streams. Their premise was that a diversified life history portfolio should be reflected in a high variability of escapement between the individual streams. In other words, in any given year, some streams should have high escapement, others low escapement, and others somewhere in between. The idea is that if populations in different streams follow different life histories that were advantageous under different environmental conditions, then some populations would do better in some years and others in other years. However, if populations all followed similar life histories, then escapement from year to year would be synchronized. They used escapement data as an indicator of portfolio diversity and found a substantial decline in recent decades among Sacramento River tributaries. In the San Joaquin Basin, portfolio diversity has been consistently low. This means the San Joaquin Basin provides virtually no buffering capacity to the greater Central Valley population. So one of the strongest steps we could take toward restoring the portfolio effect would be to restore San Joaquin Chinook populations. So how do we foster salmon life history diversity? Having a suite of habitat types along the migration corridor, and particularly within the delta, is critical. As an example of the importance of rearing habitat in the delta, coded wiretag studies have shown that young fry typically reside in the delta around 2 full months. Juveniles that enter the delta as fry are usually not expected to contribute substantially to adult escapement because their small size makes them vulnerable to high predation. However, the majority of young salmon that enter the delta are young fry, and recent otolith studies show that these fry are actually a major contributor to adult stocks in the Central Valley. Recent evidence also suggests that delta rearing is more important to larger juveniles than previously thought. Although very large juveniles have been observed to migrate through the delta relatively quickly, a recent collaborative study by NIMS, Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife, and DWR suggests that winter run-sized juveniles, which are more mid-sized, may spend a month or more in the delta. In other words, the fish are behaving counter to the leaky pipe model, which advocates pushing juveniles through the system as fast as possible. This is compelling evidence that delta rearing is an important life history variation, and we need to provide habitat to support this life history trait. We mentioned that flow affects route choice of young salmon moving through the delta and ultimately juvenile survival. But flow has surprisingly little effect on the availability of rearing habitat along much of the lower Sacramento River. The reason is that the banks of the Sacramento River through the delta are very steep, so that increasing flow does not substantially increase habitat area. Here we show some published model results which show that for a wide range of delta flows, there's almost no increase in the amount of shallow water habitat for migrating fish. This is in contrast to the adjacent Yolo Bypass floodplain, where even modest amounts of flow result in huge increases in the amount of shallow water habitat for young salmon. This means that increasing flow in the lower Sacramento River adds virtually no rearing habitat until flows are high enough to spill into the Yolo Bypass. Floodplains do not simply add habitat area. As our research group has documented in the Yolo Bypass, floodplains also provide conditions for superior growth compared to the adjacent river channel, which has also been documented in the Consumnes River. Why does the lower Sacramento River and other delta channels make such poor habitat relative to the floodplains? Perhaps because the primary habitat type in the delta is riprap. There's evidence that young salmon specifically try to avoid riprap. In addition, our work has shown that food availability is poor in riprap channels compared to seasonal habitats like the Yolo Bypass. We also want to emphasize that additional habitat is needed further downstream for salmon. There is recent evidence from delta habitats like Liberty Island that salmon will make use of tidal wetlands if available. This is consistent with studies on tidal wetlands in other parts of the Northwest. The last thing I want to talk about is hatcheries. There's a large consensus, including a hatchery scientific review group commissioned by the U.S. Congress, that hatchery practices have been a major cause of the loss of life history diversity and of genetic homogenization of Central Valley Chinook. The group's final report was just released this last June and made front page headlines because it suggested changes that will essentially require a paradigm shift for hatchery programs in California. 3 key recommendations from the report are to eliminate juvenile releases outside their natal tributaries, to stop trying to segregate hatchery and wild populations because it never works, and instead work to incorporate wild broodstock into hatcheries, and to mark all hatchery fish so they can be identified in spawning programs. So to summarize the main points of our presentation so far, most biologists would agree that the interior delta is a bad place for fish, where mortality rates are high compared to the northern delta. So actions that minimize migration of juveniles from the Sacramento River into the interior delta are likely to increase juvenile salmon survival. Export restrictions don't seem to be one of those actions, since flow at the major entry point into the interior delta appears unaffected by exports, and since evidence suggests juveniles tend to go with the flow when faced with a route choice. On the other hand, higher levels of inflow do seem likely to reduce juvenile migration into the interior delta. By managing Sacramento River flow just to push salmon past the Georgiana leak, but managing Sacramento River flow just to push salmon past the Georgiana leak will only reinforce the narrowing of life history diversity, and in the long run will reduce the resilience and viability of the Central Valley salmon populations. In order to maximize the benefits of flow regulation must be coordinated with habitat restoration to encourage a broad array of life history trajectories. That concludes my part of the presentation, so I'll pass the controls over to Gardner to talk about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and how it fits into this picture.
Brett, has there been any consideration given to putting any type of screening device at Georgiana Slough? We've heard from previous presenters that you know, that's one of the big pitfalls there. I look around the room and there's people here that have put a lot bigger screens in the mouth of Georgiana Slough. Is there any potential efficacy or studies going on?
I'll be honest with you, it's not a really a specialty of mine, but Dennis, do you know anything about that?
They are testing now an acoustic barrier. I forget what they call it, but it's an acoustic bubble array across Georgiana Slough to passively guide fish, keep them out of Georgiana Slough and into the Sacramento River.
Does it have to be passive?
That I don't know.
I think back to some of the screens on the upper Sacramento and the electronic and acoustics and bubbles and all that just cost people their jobs that supported it, and they wound up putting in hard structures.
Well, there are people here that could talk a lot more about it than I can, but I think you might run into a problem with hydrodynamics trying to screen.
I'm not saying it
something
would
that
work,
large.
I just asked the question.
Where are you suggesting the water is going to come from for this increased habitat if it's not going to?
I don't think I was suggesting, I mean, I don't know, I'm not really management, so I don't really know about the management of flows and what's available and what's not. I think the bigger point is that when you're making flow recommendations or flow regulations, you should really consider the how it's going to interact with, say, floodplains. For instance, the Yolo Bypass, which I know you've heard a lot about, but how that you can really maximize the benefits of the flow beyond just pushing the fish past these leaks to really take advantage of this habitat where fish have really been shown to thrive. Sorry if that didn't answer your question
If I can just
I'm just assuming it's magic, but
maybe I can jump in here very quickly. A lot of times, like for floodplain activation, it doesn't take more water. What it takes is adjusting the banks, so to speak, to allow water to flow at a lower stage out into the bypass. A good example is on Fremont Weir, which is the northern part of the bypass where water flows out of the Sacramento. We are looking at doing projects there that might allow water to flow at a lower elevation, so it wouldn't have to get up to a very flood stage where it is now. It would actually flood at a lower flood rate. So, if that helps.
Hi. As you've already heard, my name is Gardner Jones, and I will be giving a brief discussion of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. In this discussion, a couple of those issues will be at least brushed over. So, as Brett said, the conceptual model for managing fish like salmon and steelhead is evolving. The leaky pipe approach has been used for years. It's been tested. It has resulted in actions that have reinforced the dominance of hatchery-produced fish and have done little to increase the viability of Central Valley salmonids. Brett's talk points out that emerging science is really showing the importance of life history diversity in these stocks, and also the need for abundant and complex habitat to support that diversity. This is reminiscent of Brett's talk right there. The Bay Delta Conservation Plan takes a new approach. It moves away from the leaky pipe model and instead embraces the bed hedging one. This bed hedging approach is all the more appropriate when considering not only salmonids, but the suite of declining delta species. The BDCP seeks to address the delta holistically and is driven by the co-equal goals of providing more reliable water supply for California and restoring the delta ecosystem. This approach is rooted in the hypothesis that large-scale restoration efforts are needed to restore ecosystem processes in this estuary and recover declining delta species. The BDCP also calls for alternative conveyance, which is designed to reduce the negative effects of exporting water solely from the South Delta. Alternative conveyance is also designed to limit the entrainment leak that Brett discussed. It was also designed to increase operational flexibility and restore more natural flow patterns in the Delta. Throughout its process, the BDCP has relied extensively on the best available science, including decades of research and monitoring from the Delta. BDCP is built on ideas that were developed through the CalFed process and the Ecosystem Restoration Program. It's been informed by a number of important recent reports, and it's a process that has been driven by the collaborative efforts of state and federal regulatory and resource agency staff, many of whom are recognized experts in their fields. BDCP has also benefited from the input of independent science advisors on several critical aspects, including the adaptive management approach, the logic chain approach, and most recently on the effects analysis review. This is a vast program covering a substantial number of aquatic and terrestrial species, which BDCP calls covered species. I will try to focus in on key conservation measures that exemplify the BDCP approach and are perhaps more relevant to the board's current task. Additional information, including the draft effects analysis, is available on the BDCP website. Here I show the three categories of conservation measures that are really the heart of the conservation strategy. There are 22 conservation measures, or CMs, including measures to restore, protect, and enhance habitat, and measures to address other stressors which have been identified as limiting factor to covered species. I will also discuss the two conservation measures, Yolo Bypass, fisheries enhancement, and dual conveyance, that include the construction of new facilities to actively change the way water flows through the delta. Biological goals and objectives are critical for this plan. They identify targets that, if achieved, are expected to aid in the recovery of declining species. They provide a link between conservation measures and desired outcomes. They help establish metrics for measuring success, and they help to guide the adaptive management process. 10 of these conservation measures focus on restoration, enhancement, and protection of habitat. Restoration goals of the BDCP include creation of 30,000 acres of aquatic habitat in the next 15 years. In all, over its 50-year term, BDCP calls for up to 113,000 acres of habitat restoration. This includes 65,000 acres of tidal marsh restoration, 10,000 acres of habitat restoration in seasonally inundated floodplain. This doesn't include Yolo Bypass and is located mostly in the South Delta. 20 miles of channel margin enhancement and 5,000 acres of riparian restoration. These actions are designed to function within the natural landscape and provide the complexity of habitat needed to support the wide range of diverse life history traits represented by native delta species. This type of diversity will be particularly important for these fishes to thrive into the future, especially given issues such as climate change, which will test the resilience of these species as well as the ecosystem. Conservation Measure 6 is channel margin enhancement. BDCP will restore at least 20 linear miles of channel margin habitat by improving channel geometry and restoring riparian, marsh, and mudflat habitats on the inboard side of levees. Primary delta channels serve as movement corridors and support rearing species such as salmon and splittail. The majority of channels in the delta are steep and armored with riprap. As you've heard several times today, by and large this habitat is homogeneous and is of low quality. As Brett just showed, these channel forms limit the ability to activate more habitat even with higher flows. The enhancements proposed by BDCP will provide for more natural areas within these corridors. This will greatly increase the ability to provide more and better habitat with even modest flows. Conservation Measure 4 is tidal natural communities restoration. BDCP will restore a substantial amount of tidal wetland habitat. at least 65,000 acres throughout the Delta and Suisun Marsh. Tidal natural communities will be restored along a continuous gradient encompassing shallow subtidal, moving up through the tidal marsh plain, and adjoining transitional upland, which will be designed to accommodate approximately 3 feet of sea level rise. We've learned a lot from places like Liberty Island about how this type of habitat can be good for species like Delta smelt. This is something we didn't realize even just 15 years ago. We now recognize how important tidal wetland habitat can be for restoring the vital rearing function of this estuary. This restoration will be designed to substantially increase the amount of rearing habitat for salmon, splittail, and possibly steelhead. It will increase the local production of food and provide a linkage to future restored habitats. Conservation Measure 2 is Yolo Bypass Fisheries Enhancement. This is probably the most universally supported conservation measure under BDCP, at least amongst fisheries biologists. Yolo Bypass offers a lot of benefits to a suite of native species. It has natural functions that are, at least relatively speaking, more easily enhanced to provide a lot of bang for the buck. DWR and USBR recently released the Yolo Bypass Salmonid Habitat Restoration and Fish Passage Implementation Plan. This report points out that although alternatives still need to be developed, a main focus will be to alter flood control structures to allow for more frequent and longer duration flooding that is more closely aligned with the timing of target species. We recognize enhancements to the Yolo Bypass will need to take into account current land uses, such as flood control and agriculture. The Yolo Bypass is approximately 59,000 acres. When inundated, it roughly doubles the wetted area of the Delta. This conservation measure represents the largest opportunity for restoring seasonally inundated floodplain in the entire Central Valley. Modifications to this measure will include fish passage and flow management facilities at Fremont Weir, improvements to Lisbon Weir, and realignment of Lower Poudre Creek. Yolo Bypass enhancements will increase food production on the floodplain, provide access to additional spawning habitat for splittail and additional rearing habitat for splittail, salmon, and possibly steelhead. When Yolo Bypass is inundated, it creates an environment that is really good at providing additional nutrients and water surface area, which can increase the biological productivity. Because this is happening on such a large scale, this increased production can also supplement the aquatic food web in the estuary. Increased availability and production of food in downstream areas, including restored habitats in the Cache Slough region and Suisun Marsh, are expected to benefit Delta and longfin smelt. It's important
Gardner, can you stop there? Can you go back
Sure.
to the slide that showed the previous one that showed that one?
Yep.
Okay, I'm trying to get to a little bit better answer of Fran's question a few moments ago. I mean, this certainly is acknowledged and pretty broadly accepted as a functional proposal, but it's going to take, this is being flooded right now in times of high flow and spillage over the Fremont Weir. If you back up to your picture of Liberty Island to answer Fran's question, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but keep going. Keep
To
going.
where?
Just keep going back. You may have passed it. Yeah, you did.
don't-
Go the other way. I want the one to Liberty Island.
I'm not sure I actually have a picture of Liberty. I mean,
No, I
this
thought you-
is Liberty
You
Island.
did.
Oh,
Yeah,
Brett had
okay.
one.
The picture of Liberty Island.
Yeah.
To Fran's question, where's this water going to come from? I don't see that, you know, the two alternatives you've got, both of them are functional. The Yolo Bypass does require new water and new flows or different timing of it. Liberty Island doesn't require any additional flows. It ebbs and flows in and out of it, but it's the same water that's in the system. Is that not correct? Or if I'm wrong, don't hesitate to tell me so.
No, I mean, that's correct. The degree to which Liberty is inundated depends on the tides, but yeah, it's currently open to.
My point is all restoration isn't created equal.
Correct.
In this situation. Some of it requires ingenuity, or in
Yes.
the case of Liberty Island, an act of nature that we'll all take credit for, or it may in fact require additional flow. Just to put that in perspective, I think, and hopefully that helps answer your question a bit.
Yes, I think that is a good point.
Now that I've got you out of sequence, if you can find where you were.
Yeah, this is going to be fun now. You caught me just perfectly, actually. It's important to remember that this is a highly variable system. There can be a lot of uncertainty when trying to determine the degree to which restoration actions, such as the one that I've just talked about, will translate into more fish. While we may know more about how these actions can benefit species like Chinook salmon, the ability of restored habitats to provide food at the right times and locations to benefit species like delta smelt is less certain. The adaptive management process provides the flexibility needed to test these actions and learn from them. Using biological goals and objectives to guide this process, and through careful design, implementation, and monitoring, large-scale restoration represents one of the most promising approaches to restore the delta ecosystem. Consistent with the bet hedging approach, BDCP also incorporates 10 aptly named other stressors conservation measures. These measures cover a broad range of actions, including efforts to better manage methylmercury in the delta, maintain increased dissolved oxygen levels in the Stockton Deepwater Ship Channel, and support plans for preventing stormwater pollution. Predator control and non-physical fish barriers are two other stressor conservation measures which are being considered and may prove useful as near-term actions. It's important to note that these tools are more consistent with the leaky pipe conceptual model and are designed to address symptoms of the ailing delta rather than the root cause. They do, however, demonstrate the comprehensive approach of the BDCP and represent specific actions that should provide measurable benefits to covered species. New water facilities and operations are a key element of the BDCP conservation strategy. Conservation Measure 1 is dual conveyance. When planning for dual conveyance, the physical design, size, location, and alignment of new facilities are incredibly important considerations. But the ability of dual conveyance to help achieve the co-equal goals will depend on how it is operated. One of the chief advantages of dual conveyance over our current system is the flexibility it affords. That flexibility is roughly summarized on this slide. Some of the important criteria identified early in the process for designing how the North Delta facilities would be operated were the need for sufficient bypass flows, or the flows that would remain in the Sacramento River and bypass the diversions. The need to maintain pulse flows, which we've heard about today, as well as in Workshop 1, there was a good discussion. And also the need for real-time operational guidance like that currently provided by the Smelt Working Group and DOS. There are key outstanding uncertainties regarding how dual conveyance will affect flow patterns, covered species, and ultimately the delta ecosystem. While it is our goal to address as many of these uncertainties as possible prior to constructing new facilities, some will remain until dual conveyance is operational. Through adaptive management, the BDCP will be able to address these uncertainties and modify operations as necessary. The BDCP represents a new approach. There is uncertainty regarding how effective many of its conservation measures will be. This demonstrates the need for an adaptive learning process to help and to test the hypotheses that this approach is built on. The decision tree process is an adaptive management tool being considered through BDCP to test the need for and benefits of increased outflows in the spring and fall to meet specific biological objectives for longfin and delta smelt. This simplified diagram, looking at fall outflow to benefit delta smelt, is meant to illustrate how this tool can be applied to test key uncertainties and to guide management. This also demonstrates the importance of establishing goals and objectives that are smart and that can be used to test various management actions. There are good examples of how adaptive management can be used in the Delta. Through efforts like the flash studies, we are already learning more about how this estuary functions to support important species like Delta smelt. The bed hedging approach that BDCP uses means that we will be creating a lot more knobs that can be adjusted. It also means that we will have a lot to learn about how these conservation measures function and interact. The adaptive management process provides the flexibility to allow for substantial changes to make the plan work better over time. Monitoring and research will be used to measure plan effectiveness and to assess uncertainties and improve understanding of the Delta ecosystem. Now Dennis will talk to you about some of the near-term DWR efforts focusing on habitat restoration and moving into the implementation arc of this management cycle.
Actually, I'd like to ask the board's indulgence in allowing Gardner Jones to leave. He got a phone call a few hours ago from his wife. She was admitting herself to the emergency room with what we think is a kidney stone. So I think his time is better spent there than here at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Am I going backwards here? Oh, I am. Left one. Got it. There we go. There we go. As Gardner mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the habitat restoration projects and programs we have ongoing through the department and our sister agencies. These restoration projects focus mostly on the Delta, Suisun, Marsh, and Yolo Bypass. I'm going to talk about some of the requirements for restoration, some of the drivers behind why we're doing this, the goals and objectives of these programs, the strategy for implementation, the plan for implementation, and then focus a little bit on some of the project areas, and then give a couple slides on some specific examples of restoration projects that we have in the planning stage. First, I want to talk about the Fish Restoration Program Agreement. This is an interagency agreement between the Department of Water Resources and the Department of Fish and Game. It was executed in October of 2010, and its function is to describe the framework of how the departments are going to work together to achieve the habitat restoration requirements of the biological opinions and the longfin smelt incidental take permit. Particularly, there are three, whoops, let me back up a little bit. Oh, there are three main reasonable and prudent alternatives or actions that are called for in the Fish and Wildlife Service Delta smelt biological opinion. The Department of Water Resources is required to restore 8,000 acres of intertidal and associated subtidal habitat. In the National Marine Fisheries Service anadromous fish biological opinion, action 1.6.1, we're required to restore 17,000 acres of floodplain habitat. And in the Fish and Game's longfin smelt incidental take permit, we're required to restore 800 acres of tidal habitat in what most likely will be Suisun Marsh or Suisun Bay for longfin smelt.
When you say you're required to do this, is this DWR money that's doing this, or what?
This is all funded through state water project funds.
State water
So
project?
these are the state water project funding from our contractors that we deliver water to. So one of the first things...
Is it true, Dennis, you guys have commissioned Lewis and Clark to find this land?
I'm sorry, what?
Is it true you've commissioned Lewis and Clark to find this land for you?
Core of discovery.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be as successful as they were.
Well, we'd like to ask, too, that anybody who's interested in donating land, we're more than willing to
Yeah.
take any such land.
Yeah. One of the first things that is called for under the Fish Restoration Program Agreement, or FRPA, is the finalization and development of this implementation plan, or implementation strategy, as we're calling it. And this plan basically lays out how we're going to get there to the 8,000 acres for the most part, and the 800 acres called for under the ITP. It identifies or categorizes the restoration projects basically into two categories, what we're calling near-term projects and future potential projects. We think that from what the projects that we have identified and are in some form of the planning stages now, we believe we can get into the neighborhood of about half of the 8,000 acre requirement, somewhere around 4,000 acres. It's just kind of a ballpark figure, which leaves an additional half coming from projects that we have not as yet identified. The goals and objectives of the FRPA program, of course, are to restore 8,000 acres, to restore functions and processes that promote primary and secondary productivity and export of that productivity to pelagic habitat elsewhere in the Delta. And this is an important point I want to make, that we're not just restoring habitat, we're actually trying to restore the historical I'm sorry?
The right habitat.
Yeah. We're trying to restore the processes that, that lead to the creation of these habitats and maintain them and sustain them. One of which, the tidal habitats were historically extremely important for feeding the rest of the Delta. It was its productivity up in the tidal marshes that the nutrients were exported to elsewhere in the Delta, and basically was the breadbasket of the Delta. With the loss of these tidal marshes, we've severely lost the ability of the Delta to produce these, or this particular ecological function. And this is something that has become apparent in the pod studies, the pelagic organism declines that I think you've heard about, is that the Delta is food limited. So by restoring these tidal habitats, we think we can get back to that, that function that is so important. Another goal and objective is to enhance migratory pathways for salmonids, and to monitor and adaptively manage. That's a very big part of our program. And lastly, to be consistent with other Delta plans and programs. And as I'm sure the board knows, there's many programs out there, such as BDCP, the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Plan, Ecosystem Restoration Plan, and a number of HCPs and NCPs that are currently in existence. So this takes a lot of effort and a lot of coordination to make sure we don't get crosswise. And as an example of how this, the FRPA program links to BDCP is there has been an MOA that has been executed between the BDCP parties and the regulatory agencies that basically states that whatever habitat that we create to meet the targets of the biological opinions could also count towards BDCP acreage targets. So there's a real tie-in between these two programs. Some of the near-term actions that we've been currently planning and are looking to fund or potentially fund through the FRPA program are, let's see, I don't have it, oh, I guess I can use the mouse. I want to focus first on the Cashloo area, what we call the Cashloo complex in the northern part of the Delta, right up here, north of Rio Vista. We have several projects ongoing in various stages of planning. The Lower Yolo Restoration and Enhancement Project is something that is being led by the state and federal contractors water agency. It's at the very, at the southern portion of the Yolo Bypass. Liberty Island Enhancement, that Liberty Island is currently owned and managed by the Department of Fish and Game. There may be some potential to do something there and enhance that. So we're talking to Fish and Game about that. Little Holland Tract protection, and also Prospect Island restoration. So as I mentioned, we're focusing on the Cashloo area for a number of reasons, one of which is that it currently has probably the most existing functional tidal habitat in the Delta, and we want to try to enhance that and get some restoration projects going in that area to try to enhance that already existing habitat value. Another reason is that there is some areas of public land. As I mentioned, Liberty Island is one, Prospect Island is another, which makes restoration a little bit easier if we don't have to go out and acquire the properties. And another is that much of this area that is currently not in habitat is of a suitable elevation for tidal habitat restoration. And that's the area in green here, this green band is what we've identified as having suitable intertidal elevation if we were to restore tidal action to those areas. And I also want to point out this yellow here. This is sea level rise accommodation lands, something very important to BDCP and to FRPA. We need to plan for areas where these tidal marshes can migrate to when sea level rise actually causes a higher elevation of water in the delta. We need to be able to allow those tidal marshes to migrate upslope, so to speak. So we're trying to build into these projects the ability to have those areas as part of the project that would initially function as terrestrial habitat, but in 50 years may indeed be tidal marsh. So I want to talk just very briefly about what probably is the signature project for the Department of Water Resources in the area, and that's Prospect Island. Prospect Island was historically farmed up until the mid-90s, early 90s. Excuse me, mid-90s to late 90s, and it was acquired by the Bureau of Reclamation to be part of the North Delta Wildlife Refuge, which was going to be a large federally run wildlife refuge in this area. That failed to get congressional authorization, and the project died, so they were ended up basically stuck with this property. We took it off their hands in 2010, free of charge, which was had a good deal there. And we have been looking to, the whole idea behind that was to breach the levees at some point and restore tidal action to this area. We own roughly is the northern 2/3 of Prospect Island. The southern third of it is owned by the Port of West Sacramento, and we've been in some discussions with them, and they seem to be amenable to the fact, to the idea of doing one large restoration project on the island rather than two separate ones. As it stands now, Prospect Island is currently mostly inundated. It's said it hasn't been farmed for almost 20 years now, so much of the island has gone feral. There are vast tracts of invasive aquatics, vegetation that is going to be a challenge, but we're going to have to deal with in the restoration project. You might it has a history of the levees breaching, and you might recall the last breach event occurred in 2007, 2008. There was a massive fish kill, and consequently it was on the front page of the Bee for about a week running. That was the last time the island breached, the levees breached. It was, the levees were repaired, and unfortunately there is a culvert under the island that does convey water from Minor Slough onto the island, so that's the source of the water. But it really functions like a diked wetland now. It's not tidal habitat. We are currently in the stage of planning where we're looking at and modeling conceptual designs. Which actually is happening as we speak. We hope to be to the point sometime next year, early next year, we hope, to have some alternatives that we would then put through the environmental review process and the public review process, and move forward with picking a project and moving forward with analyzing and potentially implementing.
I have a quick question. You noted Port of Sacramento was a landowner there. Are you working with them at all, since there's a potential habitat restoration?
Yeah, we are. They own their property was bought for mitigation for the Deepwater Ship Channel deepening project. So at least they're interested in talking to us about merging those two projects, and the individual mitigation credit would be divided up somehow, but instead of having two projects, we'd have one, which we both think is a better idea. So the conceptual, excuse me, designs that we're looking at would involve multiple breaches at some points on the island, and we also are looking at potentially using something like an overflow weir, which we think would enhance rearing for salmonids. Looking now at Suisun Marsh, we have a number of areas that are in the planning stages. 4 notable ones are Thule Red enhancement, Hill Slough restoration, Overlook Club restoration, and Means Landing. In December of 2011, the Suisun Marsh Habitat Management Preservation and Restoration Plan was released. This is a 30-year plan whose goal is to balance the needs of managed and tidal wetland dependent species, and mostly to help recovery of threatened and endangered animals. And the goal is to restore up to 7,000 acres of habitat for tidal marsh dependent species. The Overlook Club restoration is one that we are currently actively involved in. We are just about in escrow for the purchase of this property. It's located in the, as you can see, in the northeast corner of the marsh. The area is currently diked, and it functions as a duck club, hence the term Overlook Club. And by breaching the levee and restoring tidal action, we believe it will provide benefits mostly to Delta smelt, longfin smelt, and Chinook salmon, and potentially steelhead. It's about 245 acres in size, and as I mentioned, it's currently operated as a duck club. It has high-quality adjacent habitat to it, which is a really good feature of this project. Is we're looking at hopefully maybe being the core of the area and being able to restore other areas adjacent to it. Looking now at the Yolo Bypass, I'll just very briefly go over this because Gardner touched on many of the projects here. But this is another area we're looking, the FRPA program is looking at providing at least financial support. As Gardner mentioned, these are all projects that are called for in the biological opinions. And Gardner mentioned the plan that's currently has just been finalized, joint project between the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation. And the objectives of this plan is to essentially carry out the requirements of the biological opinions, which are to increase seasonal floodplain, reduce stranding, increase primary and secondary productivity, and improve fish passage, which is very important. And lastly, I want to just touch on a project that we're involved in. It's not so much a restoration project, it's a research project. But we're looking, hopefully looking at this to provide some really important information to inform our floodplain restoration projects in the future. And this is the Nags Ranch Experimental Floodplain Habitat Investigation. And this is a collaborative effort between Department of Water Resources, UC Davis, and the Bureau of Reclamation. And it's essentially to assess using ag lands to as habitat for juvenile salmonids. There was last year a pilot project was begun, mostly just to look at to test methods of how we might assess things like fish growth on these flooded lands and some of the other things. And this project will expand next year. And we're looking hopefully at this to inform future restoration designs and future restoration plans. Basically, we want to learn what works and what doesn't work and apply that knowledge in the future. So that's all I had. Oh, my summary slide.